观众朋友们好，欢迎收看美国之音的时事大家谈，我是许波。2001年12月，中国加入世界贸易组织，是冷战之后对世界影响最重大的地缘政治事件之一。中国在入世后的20年里，对外贸易额增长了8倍多，超过美国成为世界第一大贸易国，并且在不到10年内成为世界第二大经济体。专家指出，如果中国当年没有入世，世界格局会大不同，至少中国不会像现在这样强大。但也有贸易专家表示，让中国入世是必然选项，只是中国的发展轨迹偏离了初衷。允许中国加入世界贸易组织，是不是美国当年犯下的一个战略错误？如果中国没有入世，今天世界的格局又会是什么样子的呢？美国之音记者林枫采访了经济政策研究所高级经济学家罗伯特.斯科特、加图研究所高级研究人员林西科姆、芝加哥全球事务委员会研究员希契、保守派专栏作家章家敦以及美国企业研究所国际贸易专家巴菲尔德。好，我们下面就请专家就如果中国未入世，当今世界会如何来发表他们的看法。
I think China's entry into the WTO and more generally the way in which China has globalized its economy has had a pernicious effect on workers, not just in the United States, but around the world. And in the US alone, my research has shown that massive growth in the trade deficit with China and imports from China have cost the U.S. about 3.7 million jobs through 2018. And I think those losses have considered, although the nature of our trade has changed since then. There were many people who claimed that China's entry into the WTO would do several things to reform China's economy, that it would make it more open to imports, that it would and also that it would lead to a greater economic and political freedom in China as the Chinese workers and firms became exposed to businesses in other countries. Well, as we know, just the reverse has occurred. And in fact, China is now a growing hegemon, and it's expanding its influence, taken over Hong Kong, has its eyes on Taiwan. So clearly, there were many unintended consequences, and these are just a few of them. I think that it's clear that China did not abide by its commitments, and that we should have demanded much tougher conditions in order to allow China into the World Trade Organization. We should have demanded that China not engage in currency manipulation as a condition for membership.
China was going to become a major economic power, whether or not it got into the WTO. WTO membership facilitated that, I think. The other thing to keep in mind is, well, two things. One, at the time, internal dynamics, both political and economic in China, seemed to be moving in the direction that it would be able to become a good standing member of the WTO and follow it. As we know, in the subsequent decade after they got in, and particularly after the presidency of Xi Jinping, China has turned away from the economic liberalization, and to some degree political liberalization, that it seemed to be moving for those who had to make the decision about the WTO in the 1990s. Seemed to be moving toward. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is a conundrum that is ever more important today, is that it is inconceivable to have a system called a world trading system that does not include what is now the second largest economy in the world, and it will become in the next decade probably the number one economic. So that is a kind of a background to where we are today. Having said that, it is certainly true that the Chinese policies from the beginning did not live up to WTO rules. Now, we have to keep in mind, again, be careful about history here. China did agree to a number of internal reforms and external reforms in terms of trade rules when it got into the WTO, some of which it has followed. The problem you face is, and it seemed at the time, or the hope at the time, was that China would move on a trajectory that would allow it to become more open and live up in an ever better fashion to WTO rules. China, however, turned in a different direction.
It's not only a mistake, it's a mistake that history will remember. We Americans and people around the world thought that as China became prosperous, it would become benign. Certainly, we've changed the attitudes of the Chinese people, but unfortunately, the Chinese people are not in control of their country. What we did with the Chinese regime, the Communist Party, was not only strengthen it, but make it more belligerent, certainly more aggressive. So when we look back, we can see that we should not have allowed China into the WTO. We paved the way for them with our 1999 trade agreement with Beijing. And since that time, we can see that China's been moving in the wrong directions.
Well, I think the most significant problem is one that's not talked about nearly enough, and that is that China was allowed for most of the last 2 decades to engage in massive amounts of currency manipulation. And this has led to undervaluation of the Chinese RMB. It's probably undervalued against the US dollar even today by 25 or 30%. This acts like a massive subsidy to everything China exports to the United States, and it acts like a tax, not just on US exports to China, but on US exports to any country in the world where we would compete with China, to Europe, to Mexico, Canada, any other country. We might sell our goods. It's very hard for US firms to do that because Chinese exporters would be able to come in at such low prices. So this is, I think, the original sin, and it really dates back to China's devaluation. And I think the WTO and China's failure to live up to its commitments there, to expand imports, to open markets, there's been lots and lots of noise and fury about those particular problems in the WTO, but not nearly enough attention to these broad economic factors, that is, to the currency issues that are really the single most important driving factor behind these growing trade deficits and job losses, and the downward pressure on American wages as well, which I think have had enormous impact in our economy and in the world.
I think the continued use of state-owned enterprises to effectuate Chinese policy is probably the biggest area in which the United States complaints about China's economic model are quite legitimate. Now, that said, WTO rules allow for state-owned enterprises. So it's not the mere existence of state-owned enterprises. It's using those state-owned enterprises to carry out Chinese government policy. So, for example, using state-owned banks to deliver cheap credit or excess credit to favored industries. And that can allow China to evade some WTO disciplines, or at least try to. And on top of that, it eliminates the transparency that China had promised to provide with respect to Chinese subsidies and the rest. So I think if there were one area where China has most definitely fallen short, it would be in the area of state-owned enterprises as policy vehicles.
And the fact that under Xi you have had this combination, and we can come back to what's happening now later, of increasing state control, attempt to state control of the economy, and the continuing refusal to live up to WTO rules to open their economy to the companies of other nations. And then you add to that the continual and increasing subsidies, particularly in the high-tech sector, so that China has steadily moved away from being able to fulfill what are the certainly implicit obligations, and in some cases explicit obligations of the WTO.
Certainly the world would have been very different if China had not ceded to the WTO in 2001. How it would have been different, we don't know. There are so many what ifs, but it's unlikely that China would be as strong today as if China had not joined. So in retrospect, we can say that this was a big mistake on the part of not only the United States, but a generous world. The lesson that we should learn is that the nature of regimes matters. This is the lesson from Ronald Reagan. After the end of World War II, the United States was the most powerful nation in history. But what did we do? Did we try to increase our dominance or preserve it? No. What we did was the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan created strong, vibrant economies in Western Europe. And that's been a good thing for not only Western Europe, but for the United States and the world as a whole. So American policy was to marginalize itself after the World War II. We did the same thing in essence after the Cold War with China. But the nature of the Chinese regime meant that this policy has been spectacularly unsuccessful, has been a tragic mistake. So the lesson is the nature of regimes matters. You can deal with democracies, you can trade with democracies, but militant totalitarian regimes, and China, by the way, is no longer authoritarian. It's semi-totalitarian, moving back to totalitarianism.
Its growth might have been slower. It would still have emerged, I think, in the decade after 2000 and certainly 2010 as a major economy. It may not have gotten to where it is today, but you've got to realize that even outside of the WTO, if you're one of the smaller nations in Asia, or even the nations of the European Union, it's likely they would have made some arrangements so that some reciprocal arrangements so that the Chinese would have moved further into, I think, the world economy. I don't think that was, stoppable. I don't think just the fact that they got into the WTO, it certainly facilitated matters. It certainly set them within a framework of tariffs in terms of international trade rules beyond the tariffs. And so it did facilitate it. But I think even absent being in the WTO, China would have emerged as a major economy.
I think it's hard to rerun history, but I think we could have been much tougher. But let's just take your premise and assume that China was not allowed to join the WTO. Would that have prevented China from engaging in these activities I've talked about, from engaging in massive currency manipulation? I don't think so, actually. I think the problem is we gave up our leverage at that point. We could have demanded more, but we chose not to. But the real problem here, I think, is that having a strong dollar is good for Wall Street. It's good for foreign investors who want to buy up assets in the U.S. and for U.S. firms that want to invest abroad. It makes it cheap to invest in places like China, and China, of course, at the same time, offered massive subsidies, at least initially, to foreign investors to get them to bring their knowledge, their technology to China, and that just increased the outsourcing of jobs from the U.S. to China. But the other reason this works in the interest of big business and Wall Street is that it made workers much more compliant. Firms could threaten to move to China and tell workers, if you insist on demanding higher wages or better benefits, we're going to shut down your plant. We're going to move. And so it increased the bargaining power of these firms. And this has been a major theme of the past 20 years, is the growing dominance of large corporations, multinational businesses, over working Americans. And the consequence of it has been stagnant or at best slowly rising wages for most working Americans, and many workers forced into low-wage jobs outside of manufacturing, which is what's most directly affected by trade. We've lost, again, 5 million manufacturing jobs overall, 91,000 factories as a result of this rapid erosion of our industrial base due to our declining competitiveness with China.
The WTO, I believe, is definitely still relevant, but it faces serious challenges in implementing additional rules and reforms. So on the still relevant part, the fact remains that the baseline set of WTO rules on goods, services, investment, subsidies, and other areas, intellectual property, those remain quite valuable. They remain important as a baseline level of trade liberalization and non-discrimination. Equally, I think members' tariff commitments and services commitments, while I wish they would be reformed and upgraded and more liberalized, they still maintain an excellent baseline level. And you combine those things, and those rules and those commitments remain an important part of multilateral trade negotiations, bilateral negotiations, and bilateral economic policy. You see, even now in the United States, that members of Congress and the White House are concerned about potentially violating the United States commitments with respect to non-discrimination or tariff rate levels and the rest. Certainly, they make exceptions, but they continue to value those rules. So those rules remain important. Equally, the WTO's dispute settlement system remains critical to the functioning of the global trading system.
The global economy has changed a lot in the last 20 years. China's growth is really the emergent factor for the global economy over the last 2 decades. With that change within the global economy and with China playing a much larger role in it, that has understandably created new decision points. And when it runs in parallel with a lack of a multilateral update to the WTO and legislative side of the WTO, there can be some friction, as we've seen over the past few years. And that doesn't mean that the WTO is obsolete or that it's something that has no power, but it needs to be updated. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to do this, but removing China from the picture or other key countries, other key players in the global economy is not a solution. And I think we should give the WTO some credit too. There's a lesson there that it's one of its main reasons for being is to keep trade disputes from spiraling out of control. And generally, it has succeeded. And I think that should be considered a major accomplishment. Of course, the most recent China-US trade war notwithstanding. But as with any organization, legislative changes and changes that are reactive to the business environment must be made over time and as new problems arise. And so this is where I think the WTO is currently.
The World Trade Organization has become increasingly irrelevant to the global economy because the kinds of trade frictions that we're talking about here today have essentially made it impossible to have a consensus on where we should go going forward with trade rules. I think the problem is that large countries like China, the European Union, the United States have an ability to dominate the system in ways that make it difficult to have a consensus amongst the 170 or so members that's going to set rules that are going to govern world trade. There are underlying economic and financial policies that have a much bigger influence that are not being addressed through this rules-based system.
The WTO is relevant, but it is becoming increasingly irrelevant because, of course, there are the regional trade pacts, but also there is I think, a deglobalization process that has started. Remember, trade around the world boomed when countries like the United States thought that there should be no geopolitical barriers to trade. So trade barriers came down, countries traded, countries became prosperous. But now we're seeing that there are geopolitical consequences. We're seeing an extremely belligerent China. And China's not just a rival to the United States. China believes that the Westphalian international system is no longer appropriate. It has been hinting about the imposition of worldwide Chinese rule. So this is an existential struggle. And unfortunately, we are going to see these barriers to trade raise again. And we're going to see a period of deglobalization.